Hi folks, I'm Wes Kale. Welcome to the program. In today's discussion, we're going to be talking about process mapping, the fundamentals. In my view, mapping of processes is perhaps the most valuable and the least taught skill I know of. Well, we're going to try and fix that today by pulling back the first few layers on how to do process maps well. We're going to start off by first identifying those situations when you should develop a process map and those situations when you don't, because not all situations require process maps, and we want to make sure you save yourself a bunch of trouble. We'll then provide you a simple and easy to understand drill for how to develop process maps effectively, and then talk about some rules to follow to make sure you don't get yourself into trouble as you develop your process maps. And then we'll close at the end by looking at some examples of process maps. So how about we take a look at the agenda? Our first topic, how is this going to work, will introduce the common situations that you may face which will require you to develop process maps, as well as identifying those that don't require process maps. Then, in The Bucking Horse, we will walk through the causes of why processes are typically not mapped and speak to the risks associated with mapping processes. Next, in Approach and Tools, we'll set forth Kale Partners' recommended approach to mapping processes and provide a high-level discussion of the pros and cons of various tools you could use for mapping processes. Next, we'll then look at 5 simple rules for flowcharting your processes, and then we'll close by walking through Kale Partners' recommended process for how you should apply our approach and rules to actually mapping your processes. This will be followed by a quick look at a couple of examples. So, let's take a look at our first agenda item. How is this going to work? And it all starts off with to-dos. As we've said before, our organizations are filled with challenges and opportunities, and those challenges and opportunities give rise to a constant river of things to do. Now, this stream may vary in intensity from time to time, but it can usually be divided up into 2 streams of things that are either self-evident or not so self-evident. Those to-dos that are self-evident run the gamut from make the coffee to change the paper to explain to Bill what happened. And all of those seem pretty straightforward, except perhaps the issue of explaining to Bill what happened. That might start pushing the not so self-evident line. Okay? And the important point to take away from that is that everyone's going to have their own demarcation point at which that which is self-evident leaves off, and those things that are not so self-evident begin. But regardless of what to-do you are assigned, whether it's making the coffee or explaining to Bill what happened, at some point it will not be clear to you how to get done what it is you're being asked to do. However, it is also likely that the guidance you get from management won't be much different, regardless of whether it's self-evident or not so self-evident. In other words, no matter how difficult the task that you are assigned becomes, you can expect to get the same simple, get this thing done instruction. And so you're going to have to figure things out. And with the exception of leadership and ethical issues, perhaps the most common problem we face on a day-to-day basis in organizations is the problem of management not contemplating more thoroughly the question of, how is this going to work? They'll give you something to do. They'll say we want to achieve this goal, but they won't tell you how you're supposed to go about doing it. And when this occurs, you're going to need to determine whether this is something that can be addressed simply by asking for some guidance on what to do, or whether this is a to-do that will require mapping out a process in order to execute the task that you've been assigned. In most cases, you'll know which way to go. But in those cases where you are not sure whether you should get guidance or start mapping this out, you should ask yourself these 5 questions because they'll help figure out which way to go. Those questions are, am I unsure of what I need to do? Well, obviously, if this is the not so self-evident bucket where you're trying to figure out whether you get guidance or whether you map it out on your own, you're probably unsure of what you need to do. But you also want to know, are others involved in this? Is it just me or are other people going to have to do this? Is what I'm doing risky? Is what I'm doing complex? And perhaps most important of all, am I changing something that affects others? While this is a judgment call, in general, if you answer yes to 3 or more of these questions, then you need to map out what you're intending to do. You may be the only one who needs to refer to the process map because maybe this is an individual task to accomplish, but you're going to need something to look at to guide your actions. You're going to need a plan, and the process flow will be a key component of that plan. So going back to our examples, putting more paper in the printer may be something you don't know how to do, but you just get guidance on that and you're done. However, when you start facing issues such as implement this new software tool, or move up the schedule for the release, or provide this customer their own fulfillment process, you're definitely going to be dealing with things that are not so evident and guidance may be insufficient. You're going to have to map it out because you're failing all these tests. It's going to be risky. It's going to be complex. You're going to affect others. You're not sure what to do. You're going to need to map it out. So once again, if you answer 3 or more of these questions affirmatively, you're going to need to map it out in a process flow. And in so doing, there are 3 basic situations where you need process flows. When you're mapping out people processes, this is how folks are supposed to do something. They may have to work with systems of some sort to get things done, but the focus of the activity is on what people do, not what systems are doing. Typically, you map a people process because how business is being done today needs to change, and you need to educate folks on how the process will be executed going forward. Secondly, are system processes. This is the reverse of the first situation. Here the focus is on the activity of what systems are doing or supposed to do, not what the people are doing. In other words, people are ancillary to the process. And the difference in choosing which case it is affects what objects you use in your process map to describe the process. You'll see what I mean by that when we get to some of our examples. And the third situation is when developing a plan. I have found that developing plans for how organizations will do things is the area in most need of process flows, and is also the area most sorely lacking them. While folks will readily develop a task list of things to do, or schedule events, or even assign resources to perform the tasks and events, they seldom take the time to map out the process, the linkages and dependencies that answer the question of how is this going to work. Instead, they opt to orally explain it to their team members, and they may have to do this 500 times, and each time they forget something or add something new. So the plan on how things are supposed to get done is constantly changing, and it also changes depending upon who you're talking to. A process flow ends that. A process flow allows you to codify your plan so everyone's working off the same sheet of music. Now, in this video cast, we're going to focus upon the fundamentals of process mapping, and we're just going to look at process flows that answer the question of what you need to do. There's a more advanced level of process mapping that looks at things like how what we are doing today changes, what stays, what goes, and what is modified, as well as developing something we call the plan for the plan. This is a strategic conceptual exercise which helps you figure out what is going to be your overall strategy for implementing the project that you have. These topics will be addressed in later videocasts, but for now we just want to focus upon how you can quickly bring order to your own thoughts so that you can move forward confidently on complex and risky activities. But before digging into how to do that, I think a truth in advertising message is appropriate here. Mapping processes can be an unstable and somewhat hazardous affair. Like an unbroken horse, the issue you're trying to pin down on paper can bounce around unexpectedly, and if you're not careful, you can get kicked in the process. We'd like to avoid that. And the first thing to understand about this is that processes are not mapped for a reason. Now, in the best case, the process, whether it's a people process or a system process or plan, is not mapped because it's new. It's just an emergent issue. In this case, the issue has not had time to be considered before, so it's not surprising that there's no process definition around it. So in this case, the absence of an existing process definition is not in itself a signal that there's a problem. However, as something new, you need to keep your wits about you because you're starting to go down the path of introducing change, as we talked about in videocast 1. And introducing change has its own source of concerns. Okay? But if the issue is not new, then there's usually one of 3 reasons why the process has not been mapped up to this point in time. First of all, the people involved didn't know how. If you're dealing with a process that is performed by other folks, but they never mapped a process before because they didn't know how, then you probably have a fairly innocuous situation here. However, you need to be mindful that you are inserting yourself into someone else's sandbox, and your ability to map the process may be seen as helpful by the current incumbents, but it could also be viewed by them as a potential threat under one of the other reasons we'll talk about in a moment. You need to understand if the existing stakeholders view mapping their process as a good thing before you get started. You'll probably still have to map the process no matter how they feel, but you're going to want to know their orientation before you get too far down the road. And then there's a case of where the incumbents know how to map a process, but it was either too hard or they just didn't care. It wasn't important enough to them for them to take the time to sketch out the dependencies and relationships of the various steps that they perform on a regular basis. This is where your early identification tripwire should get triggered, and you should be alert to whether the horse is going to start bucking in one direction or another. The fact that you are taking the time and expending the effort to do something that they did not do, even though they knew how to do it, will raise questions in people's minds about why you're doing it. Why is it worth it to you to expend this effort? What are you going to do with this information? How will management view you with respect to the incumbents when this process is mapped? Are they going to view you as a smart guy, smarter than the people who are doing it, or as a troublemaker? You need to start thinking these things through. In short, your action could start stimulating concerns and fears among others about what this means to them. And as we said in the very first videocast on what is project management, when people begin to think that what you're doing is a risk to them, it has a meaning to them that is dangerous, that can be the first tendrils of your experiencing resistance. Which brings us to the fourth reason processes aren't mapped. It's either too risky to do so, or the mapping of the process is actively opposed. Sometimes folks won't map their processes because they feel that their knowledge of the process is what makes them indispensable, and that documenting the process will make them vulnerable to replacement. And that may or may not be true, but people can believe it. Or documenting the process could elevate visibility into certain practices that are presently taking place that are not as efficient or effective as they could be, but those practices are valued by stakeholders for reasons other than efficiency and effectiveness. And they don't want those practices more closely examined. They prefer not to have anyone look too closely at this stuff, okay? And while there are other reasons, the point is this. The stakeholders of this process are aware of the value of a process map, and they've chosen not to do it. The issue for you is to understand whether their opposition to mapping the process goes beyond having to extend the effort themselves and instead is an indicator that they may actively resist your efforts to map the process. And if you reach the conclusion that you can expect active resistance to mapping the process, well, giddy up. You now have the exciting proposition of getting accurate information out of folks who do not want to give it to you. And just as it is best to place a wild horse in a corral and tie them up to a pole while you're training them, you'll need some structure for corralling a process as well. So we're going to provide you an approach and some tools to use and some rules to follow so that you can swiftly and gracefully capture the information you need, verify that is correct, and establish it as truth for the group that you are working with in an expeditious manner. But in addition to structure, you're going to also need to keep your head up. Unless you are very comfortable with both your management team and the incumbents of the process, you need to be mindful of the fact that you are taking the first steps down the path of introducing change. And as we've discussed earlier, folks tend to have a hard time with change. So you need to be ready to explain your actions and speak to their concerns. But while the staff present one reason to keep your head up, management does as well. They have their own set of concerns. You see, management tends to be focused on the to-be part of the discussion, and the preceding steps of figuring out what we've got here and then analyzing it can appear to them as valueless at best and foot-dragging at worst. But it's your responsibility to protect both yourself and your management from the blinded by X problem. You see, while they may be focused upon the to-be process, they want to get this thing called X, okay, done, and not willing to invest in analyzing the existing process and defining how it works. You have a responsibility to do that work and to figure out what of the existing process should be retained, what we call the why, okay? And we walked through this back in videocast 2 when we talked about unconscious decisions. And unfortunately, management tends to make unconscious decisions when it comes to chasing after the goals of any project. They become so focused upon implementing a new state of affairs that they throw out those portions of the existing system that they wanted to keep. The classic throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And it's your responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen. So in order to map the process effectively, you've got to recognize that there are going to be some forces acting on this effort that have potential to throw you to the ground. And you'll need to structure your approach to mapping the process and keep your head up in order to avoid that. And we're going to spend the remainder of this discussion talking about the concrete issue of how you apply this structure to the process mapping exercise. Let's first look at the approach and tools you should use.